I poured a cloudy, yellowish liquid into a lake in Kentucky last summer. Within 90 seconds, the surface started moving. Swirls, shadows, dozens of fish converging on one spot like someone had flipped a switch underground. Total cost of that liquid? About $2.50. It was hot dog water. Not a joke, not clickbait, and definitely not something the multi-billion-dollar bait industry wants you to see. What you are about to learn has been quietly banned in fishing tournaments across the South, scrubbed from sponsored forums, and ignored by every tackle company that profits from selling you $40 bottles of synthetic attractant. It is a technique so effective that private fishing clubs had to write new rules just to stop it from destroying their business model. And the craziest part? The science behind it has been published in peer-reviewed journals for decades. Nobody hid it. They just made sure you never looked. Welcome back to Forbidden Lures, the only channel that digs up what the industry buries. If you are not subscribed, now is the time, because the algorithm does not like videos that threaten billion-dollar markets. Hit that bell, and let's get into it. 1. The Great Bait Deception and the Sensory World of Fish. Before I show you the recipe, I need to destroy a lie you have been told your entire fishing life. Because if you do not understand why this works, you will do it wrong, and you will think I am full of it. Here is the lie: that fish find food with their eyes. Close your eyes for a second. Now imagine you are a largemouth bass sitting in 6 feet of murky river water. You cannot see past your own tail. Visibility? Maybe 12 inches on a good day. That $40 crankbait with the hand-painted scales and the holographic finish? The fish cannot see it from 10 feet away. It is invisible. You paid for art that performs in a gallery, not underwater. So how do fish actually hunt? 2 systems. The first is the lateral line. Imagine 1,000 tiny microphones embedded along the entire length of the fish's body, each one tuned to detect pressure changes and vibrations in the water around it. That is how a fish knows something is moving nearby. But the second system is the one that changes everything. A fish's sense of smell is between 100 and 1,000 times more powerful than yours. When I first pulled that number from a marine biology study out of Auburn University, I thought it was a misprint. It was not. There are species that can detect a single drop of blood diluted in 10 billion drops of water. 10 billion! Now think about what happens when you toss a ball of dough, a piece of bread, or a commercial pellet into the water. The aromatic compounds, the chemical signals that tell the fish food is nearby, are locked inside a solid structure. They leak out slowly, at low concentrations, in a tiny radius. You are whispering in a stadium and hoping someone in the nosebleeds hears you. But what if you could scream? What if you could take a cheap, ordinary bait and transform it into a chemical shock wave that radiates through the water in every direction, hitting every fish within 100 feet, not giving them a choice, but hijacking their nervous system and forcing them to swim toward you? That is not science fiction. That is exactly what free amino acids do. And that is exactly what happens when you dissolve a hot dog in warm water. 2. The science of the dinner bell, amino acids and chemotaxis. Here is where the fishing industry really does not want you paying attention. Because once you understand this, you will never look at a bottle of commercial attractant the same way again. Every living thing, every shrimp, every minnow, every insect larva that falls into the water is made of proteins. And proteins are built from smaller units called amino acids. When something dies or decomposes in the water, those proteins break apart and release free amino acids into the surrounding environment. Fish have evolved over millions of years to associate those specific amino acid signatures with one thing. Food is here. Come eat. But not all amino acids trigger the same response. Researchers tested the taste and smell responses of 32 different fish species to various amino acids. Every single species responded. Not most, not the majority, all 32. And the strongest triggers came from specific types: L-glutamate, L-lysine, and L-arginine. The exact amino acids that flood out of processed meat when you break it down in warm water. Now here is the critical part. When those free amino acids dissolve into the water at high concentration, they create what biologists call a chemical gradient, a trail of scent that gets stronger the closer you get to the source. When a fish's olfactory neurons detect that gradient, something remarkable happens. The fish does not decide to investigate. Its brain does not weigh the options. The amino acids hijack its navigation system and drag it toward the source like a puppet on a string. Scientists call this behavior chemotaxis, the automatic, involuntary movement toward a chemical signal. You are not attracting the fish. You are commanding it. You are ringing a dinner bell so loud that every fish within range has no biological choice but to follow the trail straight to your hook. And the bait industry charges you $30, $40, sometimes $50 for synthetic versions of the exact same compounds you can release from a $2 pack of hot dogs. But it gets even more interesting, because a hot dog does not just release amino acids. It does something far more powerful. 3. Synergistic umami and the physics of the scent trail. This is the part that separates this method from every DIY bait hack you have ever seen on the internet. And it is the part that commercial bait companies pray you never figure out. A hot dog is not raw meat. It has been thermally processed, cured, and chemically broken down during manufacturing. That processing does something extraordinary. It preloads the meat with massive amounts of free amino acids that are ready to be unleashed the moment you add warm water. You are not starting from scratch. The factory already did half the work for you. But here is where it gets insane. Processed meat also contains nucleotides, specifically compounds created when cells break down during manufacturing. When a fish detects amino acids and these nucleotides at the same time, the neural response in its taste and smell system does not just double, it multiplies. Think of it like your phone getting 1 bar of signal in the middle of nowhere, and then someone plugs in a booster that cranks it to 5. The signal does not add up. It explodes. Scientists call this phenomenon synergistic umami, and it is one of the most powerful chemical triggers in aquatic biology. That amplified signal cuts through the background noise of the lake or river, the mud, the algae, the 1,000 other faint chemical signatures in the water, and hits the fish like a freight train. The result? An aggressive, immediate investigative response, often in under 2 minutes. Now let's talk physics, because the old-timer who first showed me this was not a scientist, but he understood something that most anglers never think about. He said 2 things: use warm water and crush the meat. He did not know the terminology, but he was describing the principles of chemical kinetics and thermodynamics. Warm water does 2 things. First, it dissolves more amino acids and flavor compounds into solution. You get a higher concentration of the trigger chemicals. Second, it makes every dissolved molecule move faster and spread further. Cold bait in cold water? The scent barely travels 10 feet. A warm solution? You are broadcasting a chemical signal to every fish within 100 feet, and that signal arrives faster than anything a cold, solid bait could ever produce. And then there is the fat. Hot dogs are loaded with lipids. When you crush them in warm water, those fats do not just dissolve. They form an emulsion, a suspension of microscopic oil droplets. Each one of those droplets acts like a tiny delivery truck, carrying fat-soluble scent compounds deep into the water column. The water-soluble amino acids hit first, creating the initial shockwave. Then the lipid-bound aromatics follow, creating a lingering scent trail that guides the fish the rest of the way. You are not throwing bait into the water. You are deploying a multi-layered chemical weapon. And this is what you get for $2.50. Meanwhile, the synthetic version of this exact mechanism sits on a tackle shop shelf for $40 a bottle. Let that comparison sit with you for a second. 4. The banned in the South controversy. So here is the question you should be asking. If this method is this effective, why is nobody talking about it? And why, in some parts of the South, is it flat-out banned? Follow the money. Look at fishing regulations in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas. You will find strict laws governing what they call chumming, the act of placing organic materials into the water to attract fish. In Alabama, throwing meat or blood-based material into the water near the shoreline can cost you up to $400 in fines. In Florida, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission prohibits chumming entirely when fishing from the beach. Now, the saltwater bans make sense from a safety perspective. Dumping amino acid-rich meat solutions into coastal waters conditions predators, specifically sharks, to associate human-occupied areas with food. That is a genuine public safety issue, and nobody should be doing that. But in freshwater, the story changes. State regulations cite concerns about nitrate loading, the idea that dumping organic matter causes algae blooms and ecological damage. Fair point if you are emptying a bucket of fish guts into a pond every day. But a cup of hot dog water? That is not an ecological event. The real crackdown comes from somewhere else. Private fishing clubs and tournament organizers. When an angler shows up to a pay-to-fish lake with a $2 pack of hot dogs and warm water and proceeds to outfish every single person using $300 rod setups and premium attractants, it creates a problem. Not an environmental problem. A business problem. Customers who spent good money on expensive gear catch nothing. They complain. They ask for refunds. They stop coming back. A tackle shop owner in the South once admitted, off the record, that if every angler switched to methods like this, he would lose nearly half his revenue overnight. So, the bans appear. Not always with honest explanations. Not always backed by environmental science, but always conveniently protecting the market for high-end bait products. I am not telling you to break any laws. I am telling you to understand who wrote them and why. Check your local regulations, fish responsibly, and make your own decisions. But at least now you know the full picture. 5. The master recipe and the circular pour. All right, here is where we get our hands dirty. Everything I have told you so far means nothing if you cannot execute this properly. And there is a right way and a wrong way. I have done it both ways, and the difference is night and day. You need 4 things. 1 regular hot dog, the cheapest brand on the shelf. A cup or container with a lid. Warm water, and a spoon. That is it. Total investment, about $2.50. Step 1. The night before your trip, or at least 2 hours before you head out, heat about 7 fluid ounces of water. You want it between 140 and 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm, not boiling. If you use a furious rolling boil, you will destroy the amino acids you are trying to release. You will cook the bait instead of activating it. This is the single biggest mistake people make, and it turns a biological fish activator into a cup of useless soup. Step 2. Take 1 whole hot dog and tear it into the smallest pieces you can manage using your fingers. Drop every piece into the container. Step 3. Pour the warm water directly over the hot dog pieces. Now, pay close attention. Do not stir it. Do not touch it. Put the lid on and let it sit for exactly 15 minutes. This resting period with the heat is what fractures the protein structure and floods the water with free amino acids. If you skip this step, you just have wet meat. If you do it right, you create a biochemical fish magnet. Step 4. After 15 minutes, take a spoon and aggressively mash the hot dog pieces into the water. Crush them. Pulverize them. Your goal is to fragment every remaining piece of protein. You will know it worked when the water turns cloudy, yellowish or whitish. That cloudiness is physical proof that the amino acids and lipids have properly emulsified into solution. If the water is still clear, you did not mash hard enough. Step 5. Seal the container. This solution stays biologically active for about 8 hours at room temperature. You have a full day's worth of fishing in a single cup. Now, for the deployment. And this is the part most people get wrong. Do not dump the liquid directly on top of your hook. If you do that, you eliminate the gradient. The fish detect the chemicals but have no trail to follow, no direction to swim. They sense food everywhere and find it nowhere. Instead, use what I call the circular pour. Pour half of your solution in a slow, wide circle around the exact spot where you plan to drop your line. You are building a chemical perimeter with a high-intensity center. As the solution diffuses outward, it creates a concentration gradient, strongest at the center, weaker at the edges. Fish approaching from any direction pick up the trail and follow it inward, straight to the bullseye. Wait exactly 2 minutes. Then, rig your hook with your normal bait, dip it briefly into the remaining solution in your container, and cast it directly into the center of that circle. Your hook sits at the point of highest chemical concentration. The fish follow the gradient. The gradient leads to the center. The center is where your hook is waiting. That is the trap. 6. Hacks, tweaks, and dominating the water. Everything I have given you so far will put you ahead of 90% of anglers on any given lake. But if you want to be in the top 1%, you need to adapt this method to the water you are fishing. Moving water changes everything. In a river or stream, the current will wash your circular pour downstream in seconds, so you adjust. Position your pour 12 to 36 inches upstream of your hook, depending on how fast the water is moving. Let the river carry the chemical trail down to the fish. If you pour directly on your hook in moving water, your scent plume is gone in 30 seconds and you are fishing blind. In still water, ponds, lakes, sheltered coves, the circular pour works exactly as described. But the chemical cloud dilutes over time. After about 20 to 30 minutes, the concentration drops below the fish's detection threshold. If you have not had a bite in 20 minutes, the method did not fail. The trail faded. Pour the remaining solution, rebuild the circle, wait 2 minutes, and drop your line back in. And now, the advanced hack that I almost did not include in this video because of how effective it is. For bass and catfish specifically, add a teaspoon of garlic powder to the mixture before the 15-minute resting phase. Garlic contains a compound called diallyl sulfide, and it acts as a second independent chemical trigger for freshwater species. When diallyl sulfide combines with the free amino acids already in the solution, the reaction is not additive, it is multiplicative. The same synergistic amplification we talked about earlier. Your effective scent radius jumps from around 100 feet to over 150 feet. You are not just ringing the dinner bell anymore, you are broadcasting it across the entire lake. I need you to understand what that means. 150 feet of chemical reach. From a single cup of solution that cost you less than $3, there is no commercially available attractant at any price point that gives you that kind of coverage. None. Conclusion. Think about every fishing trip where you came home with an empty cooler. Think about every dollar you spent on synthetic sprays, premium lures, and overpriced attractants, wondering what you were doing wrong. Wondering what the pros knew that you did not. Now you know. A cheap hot dog, warm water, 15 minutes of patience, a circular pour, and 2 minutes of waiting. That is the difference between the angler who blames the weather and the one who fills a cooler. The science has been there for decades. The research has been published. The amino acid profiles, the chemotactic responses, the synergistic umami amplification. All documented, all proven, all available for anyone willing to look. The bait industry just made sure you never had a reason to. Until now. If this video changed the way you think about fishing, hit that like button. That is not a vanity request. The algorithm uses your likes to decide whether this kind of information reaches other anglers or gets buried under another sponsored video selling you something you do not need. Every like is a vote against the machine. Subscribe to Forbidden Lures and turn on notifications, because our next video is going to expose exactly how to read water and locate fish before you even cast a line. A skill worth more than any piece of gear you will ever own. Drop a comment below. Have you ever used hot dogs as bait without knowing the science? Did this change how you see commercial attractants? Share this video with your fishing crew, because the more people know, the harder it gets for the industry to keep this quiet. $2, 2 minutes. That is all it takes to beat a billion-dollar industry at its own game.